There's nothing that can prepare a father for the moment his child simply vanishes. David Martinez learned this truth on September 15th, when his 9-year-old daughter, Ava, disappeared on their favorite hiking trail. For 8 years, they had walked these same Sierra Pines paths together. It was their special tradition. But on this day, Ava ran ahead around a bend and never came back. 3 weeks of searching found nothing. No footprints. No torn clothes. No trace of the little girl who wore a turquoise shirt and loved butterflies. Then her Apple Watch appeared by the river. The data inside told an impossible story. For 21 days, Ava had been alive and walking through the forest. She was following someone step by step. Audio recordings captured a whispered voice saying, "She can stay, but you must forget her." Who was leading his daughter into the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Martinez had calloused hands that told the story of 30 years in construction, but when he tied his daughter's hiking boots each Saturday morning, his touch was gentle as silk. The worn leather boots on his own feet had walked countless job sites, but their most important miles were these weekly journeys into the Sierra Pines with Ava, his 9-year-old daughter, who still believed her father could fix anything that was broken. Their tradition began when Ava was barely 2 years old, more carried than walking, her chubby legs dangling from David's shoulders as he pointed out deer tracks and explained which berries were safe to eat. Even then, she had been curious about everything. Why the trees grew so tall, where the squirrels went in winter, how the creek knew which way to flow. David would answer each question with the patience of a man who understood that these moments were precious. That childhood was a fleeting thing that deserved his full attention. The town of Cedar Falls nestled in the foothills like a well-worn baseball glove, comfortable and familiar. David had grown up here, graduated from Cedar Falls High, and after a brief stint trying college in Sacramento, returned home when his father's heart attack left the family construction business in need of steady hands. He'd never regretted the decision, especially after meeting Elena Vasquez at a 4th of July barbecue in 2012. She was visiting from the city, working on her master's degree in criminal justice, and David was immediately struck by her easy laugh and the way she listened to people with her whole attention. They married 2 years later, and Ava arrived in January of 2014, a winter baby with dark eyes, like her mother's and David's stubborn chin. For 5 beautiful years, their small house on Maple Street felt like the center of the universe. David would come home dusty from construction sites to find Elena grading papers at the kitchen table, while Ava colored elaborate pictures of families and animals, always adding extra details that made David wonder how such a small person could see so much beauty in the world. The cancer came without warning in 2019, aggressive and unforgiving. Elena fought with the same determined spirit that had earned her a badge as a sheriff's deputy. But some battles can't be won with courage alone. She died on a Tuesday morning in March, with David holding her hand and Ava asleep against his chest. Too young to fully understand that tomorrow would be different than today. In the months that followed, David's sister Maria drove up from Fresno every weekend, worried that a single father couldn't possibly manage alone. She meant well, but her constant suggestions about daycares and after-school programs missed the point entirely. David didn't want to manage, he wanted to be present. He rearranged his work schedule to pick Ava up from school every day. He learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos. He figured out which bedtime stories she needed when the sadness crept in, and how to make pancakes shaped like butterflies on Sunday mornings. The hiking tradition became even more important after Eleanor's death. Every Saturday, weather permitting, David and Ava would load up his old Ford pickup with sandwiches, water bottles, and Ava's seemingly endless questions about the natural world. She had inherited her mother's curiosity and her father's persistence, a combination that meant their walks often took twice as long as planned because she insisted on examining every interesting rock and following every butterfly that crossed their path. David's construction crew, men who could frame a house in their sleep and weren't given to sentiment, understood that Saturdays were sacred. They'd learned not to call unless someone was bleeding or the roof was literally on fire. Even then, they tried to handle it themselves first. They respected David's devotion to his daughter, and several of them, fathers themselves, quietly admired how he'd stepped up when life knocked him down. The Sierra Pines trail system offered dozens of routes, from easy nature walks suitable for families to challenging backcountry paths that tested experienced hikers. David and Ava had their favorites, the Meadowlark Trail with its wooden bridges and gentle creek crossings, the Pine Ridge Loop that offered stunning valley views, and the more challenging Eagle's Rest Trail that required careful footing but rewarded climbers with a spectacular overlook. Ava had her own hiking backpack, child-sized but serious, where she carried her water bottle, granola bars, and whatever treasures she collected along the way. Smooth rocks, interesting leaves, the occasional feather. She wore the same turquoise shirt on every hike, claiming it was lucky, and David had long since given up suggesting she might want variety. If the turquoise shirt made her happy, then turquoise it would be. The Apple Watch had been a birthday present in July, a compromise between David's desire to keep his daughter safe and Ava's growing independence. She'd been asking for more freedom, wanting to explore side trails and climb rocks that made David's protective instincts flare. The watch offered GPS tracking and a walkie-talkie feature that let them stay in contact when she inevitably wandered ahead. Drawn by some new discovery that couldn't wait, Sheriff Elena Vasquez, no relation to David's late wife, despite the shared surname, had taken a personal interest in their family after Elena's death. She made a point of checking in regularly, not in an official capacity, but as someone who understood that a community was only as strong as how it cared for its most vulnerable members. She'd been a sheriff's deputy herself once, before rising through the ranks to become Cedar Falls' first female sheriff, and she recognized the quiet strength in how David had rebuilt his life around his daughter's needs. Jim Hartwell ran the volunteer search and rescue coordination for the county, a role that had evolved from his decades as a park ranger and his intimate knowledge of the Sierra Pines wilderness. He was the kind of man who could read weather patterns in the morning sky and find his way through trackless forest using nothing but instinct and experience. When families called about missing hikers, Jim was usually the first person Sheriff Vasquez contacted, knowing that his calm competence could organize chaos into purposeful action. The morning of September 15th dawned clear and crisp, with that particular quality of light that promised autumn was just around the corner. David had woken early, as was his custom, and found Ava already dressed in her hiking clothes, sitting at the kitchen table with her backpack organized and ready. She'd packed her own supplies, water, snacks, the small first aid kit David had taught her to carry, with the methodical care of someone who took their responsibilities seriously. "Where should we go today, kiddo?" David had asked, though he already suspected the answer. For the past month, Ava had been lobbying for another attempt at Eagle's Rest, the challenging trail that had defeated them twice before when weather forced them to turn back. "I want to show you something special," she'd said, her dark eyes bright with the kind of secret excitement that meant she'd been planning this for days. "There's a place I found last time, when we had to come back because of the rain. I marked it on my map." Ava had been making her own maps since she was 7, carefully drawing the trails they walked and noting interesting landmarks with the attention to detail of a professional cartographer. David encouraged this hobby, understanding that it helped her feel more connected to the places they visited and more confident in her growing navigation skills. They loaded up the truck, as always, David double-checking that they had everything they needed while Ava bounced impatiently in the passenger seat, eager to begin their adventure. The drive to the Eagle's Rest trailhead took 20 minutes along winding mountain roads that David could navigate blindfolded, past familiar landmarks and scenic overlooks where they sometimes stopped to watch hawks, circling in the thermal currents rising from the valley below. The parking area was nearly empty when they arrived, unusual for a Saturday but not unheard of. Many hikers preferred to start earlier, beating both the crowds and the afternoon heat that could make the steep sections of Eagle's Rest uncomfortably warm. David was secretly pleased to have the trail to themselves. It meant Ava could explore at her own pace without feeling rushed by other hikers coming up behind them. They set off up the familiar trail, Ava leading the way with the confident stride of someone who had walked these paths many times before. The morning air was cool and pine-scented, filled with the sounds of birds and the distant murmur of water flowing over stones. It was the kind of perfect hiking morning that made David grateful for the life he'd built. However unconventional it might seem to others, for the first hour, everything proceeded exactly as it had dozens of times before. They stopped to examine an interesting rock formation where Ava was convinced she could see the face of a sleeping giant. They paused to watch a family of chipmunks gathering acorns, preparing for winter with the single-minded focus that David often wished he could emulate. They shared water and granola bars at their usual rest spot, where a fallen log provided the perfect bench and the view opened up to show the valley spreading out below them like a detailed map. It was just past the 2-mile mark, where the trail curved around a massive boulder formation, that Ava suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "That's where I saw it," she said, her voice filled with the kind of wonder that made David's chest tight with love. "The special place I wanted to show you." She shouldered her pack and started forward with renewed energy, practically bouncing with excitement. "Come on, Dad. It's just around the next bend. You're going to love it." Those were the last words David would hear his daughter speak for 21 days. David watched his daughter round the familiar bend in the trail, her turquoise shirt bright against the deep green of the pine trees. He took his time following, knowing that Ava liked to explore at her own pace and that she was responsible enough to stay on the main trail. The Eagle's Rest path was well maintained and clearly marked here, with no dangerous drop-offs or confusing side routes to worry about. He gave her about 30 seconds before calling out, "What do you see up there, kiddo?" The forest swallowed his voice, but that wasn't unusual. Sound traveled strangely in the dense woods, deflected by rock formations and absorbed by the thick carpet of pine needles underfoot. When Ava didn't respond, David felt the first small flutter of concern. She was usually quick to share her discoveries, calling back excitedly about interesting flowers or unusual rock formations. He picked up his pace, his construction-hardened legs carrying him easily up the moderate incline. Rounding the bend, David expected to find his daughter crouched beside the trail, examining some natural wonder with the intense focus she brought to everything that captured her attention. Instead, he found himself looking at an empty stretch of path that curved away through towering pines, dappled with morning sunlight, but showing no sign of a 9-year-old girl in a turquoise shirt. "Ava?" His voice carried more concern now. "Where are you, sweetheart?" The silence that answered him was complete, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant chatter of a squirrel. David's heart rate began to climb as he scanned the forest on both sides of the trail. This section offered several large boulders and fallen logs that could easily hide a small girl, and Ava had always been drawn to climbing on interesting rock formations. He began checking each potential hiding spot methodically, calling her name with increasing urgency. Behind the largest boulder, nothing. Under the fallen cedar that created a natural tunnel, empty space. In the grove of aspens, where she sometimes liked to listen to the leaves rustle, no sign of her passing. David pulled out his phone and activated the walkie-talkie feature that connected to Ava's Apple Watch. "Ava? Oh, come in," he said, trying to keep his voice calm and playful. "Dad to Ava, what's your location?" Static greeted him. Then silence. His concern bloomed into genuine fear. The Apple Watch had worked perfectly during their last 3 hikes, providing both GPS tracking and reliable communication even in areas where cell phone service was spotty. For it not to respond meant either the watch was damaged or... David forced himself not to complete that thought. There were innocent explanations. Maybe Ava had wandered farther than usual and moved beyond the watch's range. Maybe she'd found something so fascinating that she'd forgotten to respond. 9-year-olds were capable of incredible focus when something captured their imagination. He began moving faster up the trail, calling her name every few seconds. The path here was more challenging, requiring careful footing over loose rock and around tight switchbacks carved into the mountainside. Ava was an experienced hiker for her age, but these sections required adult supervision. She wouldn't have gone ahead without him, not on terrain like this, unless something had frightened her. Unless she was running from something. The thought sent a chill through David's chest. He began jogging now, his heavy work boots slipping occasionally on loose gravel, but his balance sure from decades of navigating construction sites. His breathing came harder, not from the exertion, but from the growing knot of panic in his stomach. At the next switchback, David found Ava's hiking backpack. It sat beside the trail as if placed there deliberately, not dropped or discarded in panic. The bright purple pack was unzipped, and when David knelt beside it with shaking hands, he found everything exactly as it should be. Her water bottle still 3/4 full, the granola bars she'd packed that morning, the small first aid kit he'd taught her to carry. Even her hand-drawn map was there, carefully folded and tucked into the front pocket where she always kept it. Most disturbing of all was what the backpack's placement suggested. Ava hadn't dropped it while running or lost it while climbing. She'd set it down carefully, as if she intended to come back for it. As if she'd been planning to continue her hike, but needed both hands free for something. David's voice cracked as he called her name, the sound echoing off the rock walls that rose on both sides of the trail.
"Ava, where are you?"
The response was silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. No rustling in the underbrush, no distant reply. Even the squirrels had gone quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. With hands that trembled despite his efforts to remain calm, David pulled out his cell phone. No service, as expected in this section of the Sierra Pines. He would have to hike back down to the parking area to call for help, but every instinct screamed against leaving this spot where his daughter had last been seen. Instead, he began a systematic search of the immediate area, moving in expanding circles from where he'd found the backpack. The terrain here was challenging. Steep slopes covered with loose rock and thick underbrush, stands of pine so dense that visibility dropped to mere yards. It would be easy for a small person to become disoriented, to wander off the main trail and quickly lose their way. But Ava knew better. They'd practiced trail safety dozens of times. If you get separated, stay on the main path. If you get lost, stay in one place and make noise. If you're scared, use your Apple Watch to call for help. She was a smart, responsible child who followed rules, especially rules designed to keep her safe. David spent nearly an hour searching before accepting that he needed professional help. The sun was climbing higher, and if Ava was lost somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Sierra Pines, every minute mattered. With her backpack slung over his shoulder alongside his own, he jogged back down the trail toward the parking area. His mind racing through worst-case scenarios, he tried desperately to push away. At the trailhead, David's phone immediately showed full bars. His fingers shook as he dialed 911, and when the dispatcher answered with professional calm, David struggled to keep his voice steady. "My daughter is missing," he said. 9 years old, last seen on the Eagles Rest Trail about an hour ago. I found her backpack but no sign of her." The dispatcher's questions came quickly and precisely. Description of the child, exact location where she was last seen, medical conditions, what she was wearing. David answered as completely as he could, painting a picture of a responsible, experienced young hiker who would not simply wander off without good reason. "We're dispatching units now," the dispatcher assured him. "Stay at the trailhead and wait for the first responders. Do not go back up the trail alone." The instruction felt like torture. Every fiber of David's being demanded that he return immediately to continue searching, but he understood the logic. Professional searchers needed to examine the scene without contamination from his well-meaning but potentially destructive efforts. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Elena Vasquez arrived with 2 deputies and a K9 unit. Her face was grim but determined, and David felt a small measure of relief, knowing that someone with her experience was taking charge of the situation. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said, pulling out a notebook. "From the moment you started hiking this morning." David recounted the morning in exhaustive detail, from their usual preparation routine to the moment he found Ava's backpack beside the trail. Sheriff Vasquez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more concerned as the story progressed. "The Apple Watch," she said when he finished. "You tried to contact her through it?" "Multiple times. No response at all. Not even static," Sheriff Vasquez nodded grimly. "We'll need to check if it's still transmitting location data. That could help us narrow the search area." As if summoned by their conversation, Jim Hartwell arrived in his battered Jeep, already dressed in search and rescue gear. His weathered face showed no emotion, but David had learned to recognize the signs of a man preparing for a difficult task. "How long has she been missing?" Jim asked without preamble. "About 2 hours now," David replied. Jim nodded, consulting his watch and looking up at the sky where afternoon clouds were beginning to build. "We've got good light for maybe 6 more hours. Let's get started." Within an hour, the Eagle's Rest trailhead had transformed into a staging area that looked like something from a disaster movie. Sheriff Vasquez had called in every available resource: search and rescue volunteers from 3 counties, K9 units, helicopter crews, and even a specialized thermal imaging team that could detect body heat signatures from the air. The parking area filled with emergency vehicles, their radios crackling with coordinates, and status updates that David strained to understand. Jim Hartwell took command of the ground search with the quiet authority of someone who had done this too many times before. He spread topographical maps across the hood of his Jeep, marking sectors with different colored pens, while explaining search patterns to teams of volunteers. David watched from the periphery, feeling simultaneously grateful for the massive response and terrified by what it implied about the seriousness of Ava's disappearance. "We're going to find her," Maria said, arriving with a thermos of coffee and the kind of determined expression that reminded David why his sister had never backed down from a challenge in her life. She'd driven up from Fresno as soon as he called, making the 2-hour trip in record time. "Ava's smart. She knows what to do if she gets lost." David nodded without really hearing her. His attention was fixed on the thermal drone operator who was calibrating equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie. The drones could detect heat signatures through dense tree cover, identifying anything warmer than the ambient temperature. If Ava was somewhere in the search area, the technology should be able to find her. Should be. The qualifier haunted David as he watched the first drone disappear into the forest canopy with an electronic whine. "Mr. Martinez?" A young deputy approached with a tablet computer. "We need to set up tracking for your daughter's Apple Watch. Can you walk me through the account information?" David fumbled with his phone, pulling up the family sharing settings that let him monitor Ava's location. His hands shook as he entered passwords and security codes, each step a reminder of how the technology that was supposed to keep her safe had somehow failed when it mattered most. The deputy frowned at the screen. "That's strange. The watch shows as offline, but not in the way we'd expect if it was damaged or dead. It's more like someone turned it off deliberately." "Can 9-year-olds do that?" David asked. "It's possible, but it requires knowing the specific sequence. Most kids just use the basic functions. The implication hung between them. If Ava hadn't turned off the watch herself, then someone else had done it. Someone who understood the technology well enough to disable it without destroying it." Sheriff Vasquez appeared at David's elbow. "The K9 team is ready to start tracking from the backpack location. I need you to stay here and coordinate with our communication center. But I want you to know we're putting everything we have into this search." David wanted to argue, to demand that he be allowed to join the search teams, but he understood the logic. Distraught parents could interfere with professional operations, and his presence might even compromise the dog's ability to track Ava's scent. Still, Watching the teams disappear up the trail while he remained behind felt like abandonment. The next 6 hours passed in a blur of radio updates and increasingly desperate hope. Search teams methodically covered every trail, every creek bed, every boulder field, within a 5-mile radius of where Ava's backpack had been found. The thermal drones mapped heat signatures across thousands of acres, identifying deer, small mammals, and the occasional hiker. But no sign of a missing 9-year-old girl. As afternoon faded toward evening, David found himself studying the faces of returning searchers for any hint of news. Each team leader reported to Jim Hartwell with the same devastating summary: negative contact, no sign of the subject, continuing search pattern. The professional language couldn't disguise the growing concern that was evident in shortened radio transmissions and increasingly urgent helicopter sweeps. She couldn't just disappear, David said to no one in particular, his voice hoarse from calling Ava's name during brief moments when the searchers allowed him to help. People don't just vanish without a trace. But even as he said it, David knew it wasn't true. The Sierra Pines wilderness covered hundreds of square miles of rugged mountain terrain, much of it never touched by human feet. There were canyons deep enough to hide a dozen people, cave systems that hadn't been fully mapped, dense thickets where visibility dropped to mere yards. A small person could disappear completely in country like this, especially if they were afraid or injured or being deliberately concealed. The thought of someone taking his daughter filled David with a rage so pure it was almost blinding. He forced himself to stay focused on the search efforts, but part of his mind was already calculating what he would do if they found evidence that Ava had been taken. His construction crew included several former military men who understood violence, and David had no illusions about how far he would go to protect his child. By full darkness, more than 60 volunteers had combed the immediate search area, with results that ranged from disappointing to heartbreaking. They'd found a child's sock that turned out to belong to a different hiker. They discovered old campsites and discarded trash, but nothing that connected to Ava's disappearance. The thermal imaging had identified several false positives, rocks that retained heat from the afternoon sun, reflecting signatures that looked tantalizingly like human forms until ground teams reached the coordinates to find nothing. Sheriff Vasquez called a temporary halt to ground operations as midnight approached, explaining that searchers needed rest and that continuing in darkness would be both dangerous and ineffective. David accepted the logic reluctantly, understanding that exhausted volunteers were more likely to make mistakes that could compromise the entire operation. "We'll resume at first light," Jim Hartwell assured him. "I've got teams coming in from Sacramento and Bakersfield, specialized units with experience in wilderness recovery." "We're not giving up." David spent that first night in his truck at the trailhead, unable to bear the thought of returning home to Ava's empty bedroom and the breakfast dishes still sitting in the sink from that morning. Maria brought him sandwiches he couldn't eat and coffee that turned bitter in his mouth while he stared at the dark forest and tried to imagine where his daughter might be. Spending the night, every sound made him tense: the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote that reminded him how many predators roamed these mountains after dark. He knew that Ava was smart and resourceful, but she was also 9 years old and alone in a wilderness that could kill experienced adults who made simple mistakes. Dawn brought fresh teams and renewed hope, but also the grim reality that they were now looking for someone who had been missing for nearly 24 hours. David watched the sun rise over the Sierra Pines and felt something fundamental shift inside him. Yesterday, he had been a father whose daughter was temporarily lost. Today, he was a father whose daughter had vanished, and the distinction carried implications he wasn't ready to face. The second-day search expanded the perimeter dramatically, with teams covering areas that would require hours of hiking from where Ava was last seen. Helicopter crews flew grid patterns over terrain too rough for ground teams, while specialized rescue units began checking the extensive cave systems that riddled the local mountains. Each negative report added to David's growing conviction that something unnatural had happened to his daughter. Sheriff Vasquez pulled him aside during the afternoon briefing, her expression carefully neutral. "David, I need to ask some difficult questions. Is there anyone who might want to harm you or your family? Any disputes with neighbors, problems at work, custody issues?" David stared at the coiled Apple Watch charging cable sitting on his truck's dashboard. The mundane object somehow transformed into a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. He'd plugged it in that morning out of habit, the same routine he followed every Saturday to make sure Ava's watch would be fully charged for their hike. Now the cable mocked him with its uselessness, a reminder of technology that was supposed to keep his daughter safe, but had failed when it mattered most. By the third day, the story had reached the national media. News vans lined the access road to the Eagles' rest trailhead, their satellite dishes and camera crews turning the search operation into a public spectacle that made David's skin crawl. Reporters shouted questions as he walked between command vehicles, asking about his feelings and demanding to know if he had any message for his missing daughter. "Just find her," David said into a microphone thrust in his face by a perfectly coiffed woman who looked like she'd never spent a day outdoors in her life. "Please just help us find her." The interview was replayed endlessly on cable news channels that specialized in sensational missing person cases. David found himself categorized alongside other desperate parents who had lost children to mysterious circumstances, his grief packaged into sound bites and commercial breaks. The attention brought more volunteers, but also conspiracy theorists and psychics who claimed to have visions of Ava's location that invariably led nowhere. Sheriff Vasquez did her best to filter the helpful tips from the disturbing ones, but David could see the strain wearing on her as the investigation expanded beyond simple search and rescue into something more sinister. When children vanished without a trace, the possibilities ranged from tragic accident to scenarios that parents weren't supposed to contemplate. Maria stayed close, fielding phone calls from relatives and managing the steady stream of casseroles and prayer cards that well-meaning neighbors brought to David's house. She'd taken leave from her job in Fresno to help coordinate the civilian response, organizing volunteer shifts and maintaining the social media accounts that spread Ava's photo across thousands of computer screens. "You need to eat something," she said, finding David studying topographical maps in the back of Jim Hartwell's Jeep. "And sleep. You can't help Ava if you collapse from exhaustion." David accepted the sandwich she pressed into his hands, but set it aside immediately. Food felt like betrayal somehow, as if enjoying even the simple pleasure of taste might mean he was giving up on his daughter. Sleep was worse. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ava's turquoise shirt disappearing around that bend in the trail, the last moment of his old life before everything changed. The search teams had covered more than 50 square miles by now, expanding their perimeter to include areas that seemed impossibly far for a 9-year-old to reach on foot. Bloodhounds had followed scent trails that led to dead ends at creek beds and rocky areas where tracks couldn't be preserved. The thermal imaging drones had logged hundreds of hours of flight time, creating a detailed heat map of the entire region that showed every large mammal but no sign of a missing child. Jim Hartwell's weather-beaten face grew more grim with each negative report. He'd been involved in wilderness rescues for more than 20 years, and David could see him calculating odds that he didn't want to share. After 72 hours, wilderness survival became exponentially more difficult, especially for someone Ava's age without proper equipment or shelter. There are sections of these mountains that haven't been thoroughly explored in decades, Jim explained during one of the evening briefings. Old mining areas, box canyons, places where the terrain is too dangerous for casual hikers. If someone wanted to hide something or someone, they could find spots where we might never look. The word someone hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Everyone was thinking it, but nobody wanted to be the first to say it directly. The possibility that Ava hadn't simply wandered off, that her disappearance wasn't an accident. opened doors to considerations that made David's hands shake with suppressed violence. On the fourth day, David made a decision that would define the rest of his search efforts. While the official teams continued their systematic sweep of the wilderness, he began his own parallel investigation, studying every detail of the case files and forcing himself to consider possibilities that the professionals were trained to explore gradually. He started with the charging cable, that innocent piece of technology that had become his obsession. Why had Ava's Apple Watch gone offline so completely? The device was designed to maintain basic functionality even with a dead battery, and the GPS tracking should have continued working long enough to provide at least approximate location data. The complete silence suggested either catastrophic damage or deliberate interference. David called Apple's customer service line and worked his way through multiple supervisors until he reached someone with access to the detailed account logs. The information they provided was disturbing in its implications. The device shows as manually powered down at 11:47 a.m. on September 15th, the technician explained. That's not the same as a dead battery or physical damage. Someone accessed the control settings and deliberately shut off all functions. Could my daughter have done that? It's possible, but it would require navigating through several menu screens and confirming the shutdown command. Most children just use the basic features and wouldn't know how to access advanced settings. David thanked the technician and hung up, staring at his phone with growing unease. Either Ava had learned functions of her watch that he didn't know about, or someone else had turned it off for her. Neither possibility offered comfort. That afternoon, David drove to the Cedar Falls Library and began researching missing person cases in the Sierra Pines region. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, had known him since high school and quietly provided access to newspaper archives and police reports that weren't readily available online. What he found made his blood run cold. Over the past 15 years, 7 people had vanished in the Sierra Pines wilderness under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Most were experienced hikers who knew the terrain well. Several had been carrying GPS devices or cell phones that simply stopped transmitting without warning. In each case, extensive search efforts had found no trace of the missing persons. No evidence of accident or foul play, nothing to suggest what had happened to them. The cases shared disturbing similarities. All had occurred in remote areas of the forest. All involved the sudden cessation of electronic communication. And all had baffled investigators who found no logical explanation for the disappearances. Local folklore had begun to develop around the missing persons. Stories about the Sierra Pines being haunted or cursed. But David was more interested in patterns that suggested human agency. Someone was operating in these mountains, someone with knowledge of the terrain and the ability to make people disappear without leaving evidence. The thought that this person might have taken his daughter filled David with a rage so profound it was almost physically painful. He began making copies of the case files, cross-referencing locations and dates, looking for any connection that the official investigators might have missed. The work gave him something to focus on besides the unbearable waiting. And for the first time since Ava's disappearance, David felt like he was taking meaningful action. Sheriff Vasquez found him at the library that evening, surrounded by printouts and photocopies that covered every available table surface. Her expression was carefully neutral, but David could see concern in her eyes. "What are you working on?" she asked. David explained his research, showing her the patterns he'd identified among the previous disappearances. Sheriff Vasquez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in her ever-present notebook. "We've looked at these cases," she said when he finished. "There's no clear connection beyond the general location. Wilderness areas always have higher rates of unexplained disappearances. People take risks, make mistakes, encounter situations they're not prepared for. 7 people, Elena, 7 people with GPS devices that just stopped working. That's not coincidence." Sheriff Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, studying the timeline David had constructed on the library's bulletin board. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much tragedy in her career. Even if you're right, even if there's someone out there taking people, how does that help us find Ava? We're already searching everywhere. We're already treating this as a potential abduction case. David couldn't answer her question, but he also couldn't abandon the research that felt like his only connection to his missing daughter. Somewhere in these files, in these patterns of disappearance and silence, there might be a clue that would lead him to Ava. He had to believe that. Because the alternative was accepting that she was simply gone, vanished into the wilderness, like morning mist with no hope of return. The stack of handwritten missing person flyers grew taller each night as David worked by lamplight at his kitchen table, carefully writing Ava's information on each one with the methodical precision of a man who had found purpose in routine. Her photo smiled up at him from hundreds of copies, the school picture from last spring where her hair was slightly messy and her grin showed the gap from a recently lost tooth. He'd chosen that photo because it captured something essential about Ava's spirit, the mischievous intelligence that made her special. 2 weeks after her disappearance, David had posted these flyers in every store, gas station, and community center within a 100-mile radius of Cedar Falls. He drove the mountain roads in his pickup truck, stopping at remote cabins and isolated ranger stations, anywhere that someone might have seen a 9-year-old girl in a turquoise shirt. The work gave him something to do with his hands, while his mind churned through increasingly dark possibilities. The official search had scaled back dramatically. Sheriff Vasquez maintained a skeleton crew of investigators, but the massive volunteer operation had been suspended after 10 days of intensive effort yielded nothing. Jim Hartwell still coordinated weekend searches with dedicated volunteers. But everyone understood they were now looking for a body rather than a survivor. Everyone except David. "You can't keep doing this to yourself," Maria said, finding him organizing another batch of flyers in the pre-dawn darkness. She'd extended her leave from work indefinitely, unable to abandon her brother in his obsession, but increasingly worried about his mental state. The professionals have moved on. Maybe it's time to accept what? David's voice was harsh in the quiet kitchen. That my daughter is dead? That I should give up and go back to work like nothing happened? Maria flinched at his tone but pressed on. Accept that you're not a search and rescue professional. That maybe the people who do this for a living know something you don't. David continued writing, his hand steady despite the tremor of exhaustion that ran through his entire body. Sleep came in brief intervals now, usually on the couch, where he could listen for phone calls that might bring news. He'd lost 20 pounds and developed a persistent cough from breathing dust and pollen during his solo searches, but the physical deterioration felt appropriate somehow. His daughter was suffering somewhere. If she was still alive, and comfort seemed like betrayal, the construction business was being held together by his crew foreman, Tommy Nguyen, who'd worked with David for 8 years and understood his priorities. The men had quietly agreed to cover David's responsibilities without pay cuts, pooling their resources to keep the company viable until he could return. It was the kind of loyalty that reminded David why he'd built his life in Cedar Falls, surrounded by people who understood that some things mattered more than profit margins. But even Tommy's patience had limits. "Boss, I hate to bring this up, but we've got the Morrison job starting next month. Big contract, good money, but they need someone who can be present for the daily decisions. If you can't, handle it however you need to," David said, barely looking up from the topographical maps that covered his dining room table. "Take the lead position. Give yourself a raise. I trust your judgment." Tommy nodded gratefully, but his expression remained concerned. "What about the long term? This could go on for months, years even. You need to think about your future, about what happens if what? If my daughter is never found? If I have to live the rest of my life not knowing what happened to her?" David's voice cracked on the words. "Then I guess I'll deal with that when it happens. Right now I'm still looking for Ava. The maps told a story of obsessive dedication. David had marked every trail, every creek bed, every rock formation within 20 miles of the Eagle's Rest Trail. Red X's indicated areas he'd searched personally. Blue circles marked locations where other hikers had reported unusual activity. Yellow highlights showed the spots where previous disappearances had occurred, creating a pattern that seemed almost too obvious to ignore. All of the vanishing points clustered around a remote section of the Sierra Pines that didn't appear on standard hiking maps. The area was too rugged for casual recreation, too isolated for regular ranger patrols. Old mining claims and abandoned logging roads provided access, but only for someone with serious off-road capability and extensive local knowledge. David had tried to reach this area several times, but his pickup truck wasn't equipped for the terrain, and hiking in alone violated every safety protocol he'd taught Ava. Still, the pull was irresistible. Somewhere in those unmarked mountains, answers waited for someone brave enough or desperate enough to find them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen at the library had been quietly researching the historical records of the region, following David's timeline back further than the recent disappearances. What she found was a pattern that extended back more than a century, documented in newspaper archives and territorial records that predated modern law enforcement. "Look at this," she said, spreading century-old newspapers across the research table. The Paiute tribes avoided this entire section of the Sierra Pines. They called it the place where people walk away, and their oral histories describe it as cursed or haunted. David studied the faded articles that described settlers and miners who had vanished without explanation in the same general area. The language was different, the technology primitive, but the pattern was unmistakable. For more than 100 years, people had been disappearing in the remote sections of the Sierra Pines with a consistency that defied statistical probability. What did the tribes believe was happening? David asked. Mrs. Chen consulted her notes, compiled from academic sources and tribal historians. The stories vary, but they generally describe a presence in the mountains that calls to people, particularly children and those who are vulnerable or seeking something. The Paiute avoided the area entirely, even when game was scarce elsewhere. David felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. Maybe the disappearances weren't random predation by a human adversary. Maybe something else was operating in these mountains, something that had been taking people for generations and had learned to avoid leaving, evidence that modern investigators could follow. The thought should have been comforting. If supernatural forces were responsible for Ava's disappearance, then human logic and determination might not be enough to find her. But David had never been one to accept limitations, especially when his daughter's life was at stake. Whatever was taking people from the Sierra Pines, he was going to find it and get Ava back. That night, David began serious preparation for an expedition into the unmarked wilderness. He researched survival equipment, studied military-grade GPS systems that couldn't be easily disabled, and began physical conditioning that would allow him to cover rough terrain for extended periods. If the professionals couldn't find his daughter using conventional methods, then David would try unconventional ones. The plan was dangerous, possibly suicidal, and almost certainly illegal. The area he intended to search was federal wilderness, where unauthorized camping was prohibited and solo hiking was strongly discouraged. But David had reached the point where legal considerations seemed irrelevant compared to the possibility of finding Ava. Maria watched his preparations with growing alarm, recognizing the signs of a man who had moved beyond rational decision-making into something more desperate. "You're planning to go alone into the mountains, aren't you? Without backup, without telling anyone where you'll be?" David continued packing his newly purchased camping gear, testing each piece of equipment with the thoroughness of someone who understood that mistakes in the wilderness could be fatal. "The official search is over. If I'm going to find Ava, it has to be on my own terms. And if you disappear too, if whatever happened to her happens to you, then what happens to the possibility of finding her?" David paused in his packing, struck by the logic of his sister's question. She was right that his solo expedition carried enormous risks, but he was also running out of alternatives. Every day that passed made it less likely that Ava was still alive, and David couldn't bear the thought of giving up while there were still places to search. "I'll be careful," he said finally. "I'll check in by satellite phone every 12 hours, and if I don't make contact, you can send rescue teams to my last known position." Maria studied his face, looking for signs of the brother she'd grown up with beneath the obsession and exhaustion that had transformed him into someone she barely recognized. "Promise me something. Promise me that if you find evidence that Ava is dead, you'll come home and let yourself grieve properly. Don't disappear into these mountains chasing ghosts." David met her eyes and nodded, though they both understood the promise might be impossible to keep. The line between hope and delusion had blurred beyond recognition, and David was no longer certain which side of it he was operating on. The carved symbols looked fresh, despite being cut into bark that had obviously grown around them over several years. David ran his fingers over the strange markings, not letters or numbers, but geometric patterns that seemed deliberate and meaningful in a way he couldn't decipher. The tree stood beside an abandoned logging road that didn't appear on any official map, 15 miles from the nearest marked trail and deeper into the Sierra Pines wilderness than most hikers ever ventured. David had been exploring these remote areas for 3 weeks now, using his construction company's 4-wheel drive truck to navigate old mining roads and forgotten timber tracks. The official search had ended, but his private investigation had taken on the methodical intensity of a man who understood that systematic effort could overcome almost any obstacle. Each day brought him deeper into country that few people had seen, following leads that existed only in his increasingly desperate imagination. The trail marker was the first concrete evidence he'd found that someone else was operating in these mountains. The symbols were carved too precisely to be random vandalism, and their placement beside the hidden road suggested they served as navigation aids for people who knew how to read them. David photographed the markings from multiple angles, adding them to the growing collection of documentation he hoped might eventually form a coherent pattern. His satellite phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Check-in overdue. Worried. Call me." David glanced at his watch and realized he'd been hiking for nearly 8 hours without pause, so focused on following the abandoned road that he'd forgotten his promise to maintain regular contact. The lapse worried him. Losing track of time in the wilderness was dangerous, a sign that his judgment might be compromised by exhaustion and obsession. "I'm fine," he texted back. "Found something interesting home by dark." The reply came immediately. "Sheriff Vasquez stopped by, wants to talk, says it's important." David stared at the message, wondering what new development could be significant enough for the sheriff to seek him out personally. The official investigation had been effectively closed for days, with only periodic updates about leads that invariably led nowhere. Perhaps they'd finally found something, some trace of Ava that had escaped the initial searches. But David had learned not to hope too eagerly for breakthroughs. Too many false alarms had taught him that most important developments were either misidentified evidence or well-meaning tips from people who had seen the news coverage and wanted to help. Still, Sheriff Vasquez was a professional who wouldn't waste his time on trivial matters. The logging road continued deeper into the wilderness, winding through stands of old-growth pine and around granite formations that looked untouched by human activity. David followed it for another mile, noting more of the cryptic trail markers at regular intervals. Someone had created a navigation system here, marking a route through terrain that would be nearly impossible to follow without guidance. The road ended abruptly at a clearing that had obviously been used as a campsite, though not recently. Stone rings marked old fire pits, and several flat areas showed signs of tent placement. More interesting were the structures, lean-to shelters built from fallen logs and pine boughs, constructed with skill that suggested long-term occupation rather than casual camping. David explored the abandoned camp methodically, photographing everything and making notes about what the evidence suggested. The site had been used extensively over months or years, but appeared to have been vacated recently. Whoever lived here had been careful to avoid leaving obvious traces. No trash, no personal items, nothing that would identify them or explain their presence in this remote location. But they had left something behind. Carved into the largest pine tree at the edge of the clearing was a more elaborate version of the trail markers, a complex geometric pattern that looked almost like a map. David studied the carving intently, trying to understand what it might represent. The symbols seemed to radiate outward from a central point, with lines and shapes that could represent terrain features or trail routes. As he photographed the tree carving, David became aware that he was no longer alone in the clearing. The sensation started as a vague unease, the feeling of being watched that raised the hair on his neck and made him turn to scan the tree line. Nothing moved in the forest around him, but the feeling persisted and grew stronger. "Hello," David called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding rocks. "Is someone there?" The silence that answered him was complete, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine boughs. But David's construction experience had taught him to trust his instincts about potentially dangerous situations, and every sense was now screaming that he was not alone. Moving carefully, he began walking back toward where he'd left his truck, trying not to appear hurried while keeping his eyes on the forest around him. The feeling of being observed followed him, never quite resolving into actual sight or sound, but persistent enough to make his heart rate climb with each step. Halfway back to his vehicle, David heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone moving through the underbrush parallel to his path. Not the random crashing of a deer or the scurrying of small animals, but the deliberate footsteps of something large trying to move quietly through dense vegetation. David stopped walking and listened intently. The footsteps stopped too, confirming that whatever was following him was intelligent enough to recognize that it had been detected. For several long minutes, David stood motionless in the middle of the abandoned road, straining to hear any sound that would give him more information about his unseen companion. When the silence stretched too long, David made a decision that would have horrified his sister, but felt absolutely necessary. Instead of continuing toward his truck, he turned directly toward the source of the sounds and began walking into the forest. "I know you're there," he called out as he pushed through the underbrush. "I'm looking for my daughter, a 9-year-old girl named Ava. If you've seen her, if you know anything about what happened to her, please help me." The plea hung in the air for a moment before being answered by the sound of rapid movement away from his position. Whatever had been watching him was now retreating, deeper into the wilderness, crashing through vegetation with abandon rather than stealth. David tried to follow, but the terrain quickly became too steep and rocky for safe pursuit. He found himself standing on the edge of a deep ravine, looking down into shadows so thick that he couldn't see the bottom. If someone had descended into that darkness, they possessed knowledge of the terrain that David couldn't match. Frustrated but oddly encouraged, David returned to his truck as the afternoon light began to fade. For the first time since Ava's disappearance, he had definitive evidence that someone was living in these remote mountains, someone who knew the area well enough to avoid detection by search teams, but who had revealed themselves when confronted directly. The drive back to Cedar Falls took more than an hour on rough mountain roads, giving David time to think about what he discovered: the abandoned camp, the trail markers, and most importantly, the presence watching him from the forest. All suggested that his theory about someone operating in the wilderness was correct. But who was it? And what did they want with a 9-year-old girl who had vanished while hiking with her father? Sheriff Vasquez was waiting in his driveway when David arrived home, her patrol car parked under the streetlight that Maria had installed after deciding his house was too dark for security. Her expression was carefully neutral, but David could see tension in her posture that suggested the important information she wanted to share wasn't good news. "Eleanor," David said, climbing out of his dusty truck, "Maria said you wanted to talk." "Let's go inside," Sheriff Vasquez replied. "There are some things you need to know." David's hands trembled as he stared at his phone screen, unable to process what he was seeing. After 21 days of silence, Ava's Apple Watch had just pinged his location, a single GPS coordinate from deep in the Sierra Pines wilderness, accompanied by a low battery warning that meant the device was still functional. Sheriff Vasquez leaned over his shoulder, studying the notification that had transformed David's kitchen from a place of desperate planning into a command center crackling with sudden possibility. "How is this possible? We check the Apple tracking every day. The watch has been offline since she disappeared." "I don't know," David said, his voice hoarse with equal parts hope and terror. "But we have to go there, now, right now." The coordinates placed the watch approximately 12 miles from the Eagle's Rest Trail, where Ava had vanished, in a section of wilderness that the search teams had covered extensively. Sheriff Vasquez was already on her radio, calling for helicopter support and mobilizing whatever resources were available on short notice. But David was moving toward his truck, keys in hand, unwilling to wait for official procedures when his daughter might be just hours away. "David, stop!" Sheriff Vasquez called after him. "We do this right. We go in with backup and proper equipment. If this is some kind of trap..." "Trap?" David spun around, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "It's my daughter's watch, Elena. After 3 weeks of nothing, we finally have a lead and you want to wait for paperwork." "I want to make sure we don't lose the only real evidence we've had since this started," Sheriff Vasquez replied firmly. "Give me 2 hours to organize a proper response team." 2 hours could mean the difference between finding Ava and walking into an ambush. David stared at her for a long moment, understanding the logic, but feeling every second tick by like drops of blood from a wound. After 21 days of waiting, 2 hours felt like an eternity. But Sheriff Vasquez was right. Rushing into an unknown situation without backup could jeopardize whatever chance they had of bringing Ava home safely. 2 hours, David agreed. "But I'm going with you." "Don't try to leave me behind." Sheriff Vasquez nodded, already focused on the tactical considerations of reaching a remote location in difficult terrain. "We'll need 4-wheel drive vehicles and someone who knows those back roads. Can you navigate to the coordinates?" David was already spreading topographical maps across his kitchen table, using a GPS unit to plot the exact location of Ava's watch. The coordinates placed it near the abandoned logging road he'd been exploring, close to the mysterious campsite and the cryptic trail markers that had convinced him someone was living in the wilderness. "I can get us there," David said. "But Eleanor, there's something you need to know. I think someone's been operating in that area for a long time. I found evidence of long-term occupation, trail markers, signs that people have been living off-grid in those mountains." Sheriff Vasquez looked up from her radio, her expression grim. "What kind of evidence?" David showed her the photographs from his solo expeditions, the carved symbols, the abandoned camp, the sophisticated shelter construction that indicated extensive local knowledge. Sheriff Vasquez studied each image carefully, her face growing more concerned as the implications became clear. "David, if you're right, if there's some kind of organized presence in these mountains, then we're not just dealing with a missing child case anymore. This could be kidnapping, human trafficking, or worse." The words hit David like physical blows. He'd been so focused on finding Ava that he hadn't fully considered what her captivity might entail, what she might have experienced during 3 weeks in the custody of unknown individuals. The thought filled him with rage so pure it was almost blinding, but also with determination that burned like cold fire in his chest. "Whatever they've done to her, whatever they're planning, it ends today," David said quietly. "I'm getting my daughter back. The 2 hours passed with agonizing slowness as Sheriff Vasquez assembled her response team. Jim Hartwell arrived with specialized rescue equipment, his weathered face showing no emotion, but his eyes reflecting the same desperate hope that David felt. 2 deputies brought tactical gear and communication equipment designed for wilderness operations. A paramedic team stood ready to provide medical attention if Ava was found injured or traumatized. At exactly 3 p.m., the convoy of 4-wheel-drive vehicles left Cedar Falls and headed into the Sierra Pines. David rode with Sheriff Vasquez, continuously monitoring his phone for any additional signals from Ava's watch. The device had gone silent again after the initial ping, but the GPS coordinate remained fixed in his navigation system, like a beacon drawing them deeper into the wilderness. The drive took nearly 2 hours on increasingly rough mountain roads. As they climbed higher into the remote sections of the forest, David felt his anxiety building toward something approaching panic. After weeks of searching with no results, the possibility that they might actually find Ava within hours seemed too incredible to believe. But the alternative, that this was another false lead, another cruel disappointment, was equally unbearable. "There," David said, pointing to a barely visible track that branched off from the main logging road. "That leads to the area where I found the camp. The vehicles could go no further. The final approach would have to be on foot, through terrain that was too steep and rocky for anything but the most specialized off-road equipment." Sheriff Vasquez organized her team with military precision, establishing communication protocols and fallback positions in case the situation turned dangerous. David chafed at the careful preparations, wanting nothing more than to run straight toward the GPS coordinates where his daughter's watch was waiting. But he forced himself to follow Sheriff Vasquez's lead, understanding that his desperation could compromise the entire operation. They hiked for 40 minutes through increasingly difficult terrain, following David's photographs of the trail markers to navigate routes that weren't shown on any official map. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if the normal sounds of wildlife had been suppressed by some presence that David couldn't identify but could definitely feel. "We're close," Jim Hartwell said, consulting his GPS unit. "Maybe 100 yards. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, drowning out the sound of his footsteps on the forest floor. Somewhere ahead, through the trees and shadows, his daughter's Apple Watch was waiting. And if the watch was there, maybe Ava was too. They found the watch sitting on a carefully arranged bed of pine needles beside a small creek, positioned as if someone had placed it there deliberately for them to discover. The bright band was instantly recognizable, and David felt his knees nearly buckle with them, confirmation that they had finally found tangible evidence of his daughter's presence in these remote mountains. But Ava herself was nowhere to be seen. Sheriff Vasquez approached the watch carefully, photographing its position before picking it up with gloved hands. The device appeared undamaged, though the battery indicator showed less than 5% remaining power. When she activated the screen, David leaned in to see what information might be stored in the device's memory. What they found changed everything. The watch's activity log showed 21 days of continuous data. Heart rate, GPS tracking, step counts, even ambient sound recordings triggered by the device's motion sensors. For 3 weeks, the watch had been monitoring and recording, creating a detailed record of wherever it had been. "Look at this," Sheriff Vasquez said, scrolling through the GPS data. "The watch has been moving almost continuously. Long-distance hiking patterns, multiple locations throughout the wilderness area." David stared at the tracking data, trying to process what it meant. The GPS trail showed systematic movement through the Sierra Pines, covering dozens of miles over the 3-week period. But most disturbing were the heart rate readings, steady and consistent throughout the entire period, indicating that whoever wore the watch had been alive and physically active. "She's been alive," David whispered. "For 3 weeks, Ava has been alive and moving through these mountains." But there was more. The watch had recorded audio snippets triggered by sudden movements or loud sounds, creating a fragmentary record of conversations and environmental noise. Sheriff Vasquez activated the first recording, and they listened to several seconds of static before Ava's voice came through clearly. "Are we going home soon? I miss my dad." David felt tears streaming down his face as he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in 21 days. She sounded scared but not panicked, lonely but not terrified. Most importantly, she sounded alive. The second audio recording was shorter but infinitely more disturbing. After a few seconds of rustling sounds, they heard Ava's voice again. "Who are you? Why can't I go home?" The response came from someone else, a voice that David didn't recognize, low, measured, deliberately calm. "She can stay, but you must forget her." Sheriff Vasquez replayed the recording several times, her expression growing grimmer with each repetition. "That's not a child's voice. We're definitely dealing with an adult, probably male. Someone who has been holding Ava against her will." David studied the GPS trail on the watch's screen, tracing the path his daughter had walked over 21 days. The route was complex but purposeful, leading to areas of the wilderness that weren't accessible to casual hikers. Someone with extensive local knowledge had been guiding her through terrain that few people could navigate. "Where does the trail end?" David asked, pointing to the most recent GPS coordinates. Sheriff Vasquez consulted her topographical maps, comparing them to the watch's data. "About 3 miles northeast of here. There's an old mining area, some abandoned structures that date back to the 1800s. If someone wanted to hide a child, it would be a logical place." David was already moving toward the indicated direction, no longer willing to wait for tactical considerations or careful planning. His daughter was 3 miles away, alive, and had been calling for him. Nothing else mattered. "David, wait," Sheriff Vasquez called after him. "We need to approach this carefully. If they know we're coming, let them know," David replied without slowing down. "I've been looking for my daughter for 3 weeks. Now I know where she is, and I'm going to bring her home." Artifact, Ava's Apple Watch, the technological lifeline that reveals impossible data about her 21-day journey and contains the cryptic voice recordings that change everything. David's hands trembled as he stared at his phone screen, unable to process what he was seeing. After 21 days of silence, Ava's Apple Watch had just pinged his location, a single GPS coordinate from deep in the Sierra Pines wilderness, accompanied by a low battery warning that meant the device was still functional. Sheriff Vasquez leaned over his shoulder, studying the notification that had transformed David's kitchen from a place of desperate planning into a command center crackling with sudden possibility. "How is this possible? We check the Apple tracking every day. The watch has been offline since she disappeared." "I don't know," David said, his voice hoarse with equal parts hope and terror. "But we have to go there. Now. Right now." The coordinates placed the watch approximately 12 miles from the Eagle's Rest Trail, where Ava had vanished, in a section of wilderness that the search teams had covered extensively. Sheriff Vasquez was already on her radio, calling for helicopter support and mobilizing whatever resources were available on short notice. But David was moving toward his truck, keys in hand, unwilling to wait for official procedures, when his daughter might be just hours away. "David, stop," Sheriff Vasquez called after him. "We do this right. We go in with backup and proper equipment. If this is some kind of trap..." David spun around, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "It's my daughter's watch, Elena. After 3 weeks of nothing, we finally have a lead, and you want to wait for paperwork? I want to make sure we don't lose the only real evidence we've had since this started," Sheriff Vasquez replied firmly. "Give me 2 hours to organize a proper response team. 2 hours could mean the difference between finding Ava and walking into an ambush." David stared at her for a long moment, understanding the logic but feeling every second tick by like drops of blood from a wound. After 21 days of waiting, 2 hours felt like an eternity. But Sheriff Vasquez was right. Rushing into an unknown situation without backup could jeopardize whatever chance they had of bringing Ava home safely. 2 hours, David agreed. "But I'm going with you." Don't try to leave me behind. Sheriff Vasquez nodded, already focused on the tactical considerations of reaching a remote location in difficult terrain. We'll need four-wheel drive vehicles and someone who knows those back roads. Can you navigate to the coordinates? David was already spreading topographical maps across his kitchen table, using a GPS unit to plot the exact location of Ava's watch. The coordinates placed it near the abandoned logging road he'd been exploring, close to the mysterious campsite and the cryptic trail markers that had convinced him someone was living in the wilderness. I can get us there, David said. But Elena, there's something you need to know. I think someone's been operating in that area for a long time. I found evidence of long-term occupation, trail markers, signs that people have been living off-grid in those mountains. Sheriff Vasquez looked up from her radio, her expression grim. What kind of evidence? David showed her the photographs from his solo expeditions, the carved symbols, the abandoned camp, the sophisticated shelter construction that indicated extensive local knowledge. Sheriff Vasquez studied each image carefully, her face growing more concerned as the implications became clear. David, if you're right, if there's some kind of organized presence in these mountains, then we're not just dealing with a missing child case anymore. This could be kidnapping, human trafficking, or worse. The words hit David like physical blows. He'd been so focused on finding Ava that he hadn't fully considered what her captivity might entail, what she might have experienced during 3 weeks in the custody of unknown individuals. The thought filled him with rage so pure it was almost blinding, but also with determination that burned like cold fire in his chest. Whatever they've done to her, whatever they're planning, it ends today, David said quietly. I'm getting my daughter back. The 2 hours passed, with agonizing slowness, as Sheriff Vasquez assembled her response team. Jim Hartwell arrived with specialized rescue equipment, his weathered face showing no emotion but his eyes reflecting the same desperate hope that David felt. 2 deputies brought tactical gear and communication equipment designed for wilderness operations. A paramedic team stood ready to provide medical attention if Ava was found injured or traumatized. At exactly 3 p.m., the convoy of four-wheel drive vehicles left Cedar Falls and headed into the Sierra Pines. David rode with Sheriff Vasquez, continuously monitoring his phone for any additional signals from Ava's watch. The device had gone silent again after the initial ping, but the GPS coordinate remained fixed in his navigation system like a beacon, drawing them deeper into the wilderness. The drive took nearly 2 hours on increasingly rough mountain roads. As they climbed higher into the remote sections of the forest, David felt his anxiety building towards something approaching panic. After weeks of searching with no results, the possibility that they might actually find Ava within hours seemed too incredible to believe. But the alternative, that this was another false lead, another cruel disappointment, was equally unbearable. There, David said, pointing to a barely visible track that branched off from the main logging road. That leads to the area where I found the camp. The vehicles could go no further. The final approach would have to be on foot, through terrain that was too steep and rocky for anything but the most specialized off-road equipment. Sheriff Vasquez organized her team with military precision, establishing communication protocols and fallback positions in case the situation turned dangerous. David chafed at the careful preparations, wanting nothing more than to run straight toward the GPS coordinates where his daughter's watch was waiting. But he forced himself to follow Sheriff Vasquez's lead, understanding that his desperation could compromise the entire operation. They hiked for 40 minutes through increasingly difficult terrain, following David's photographs of the trail markers to navigate routes that weren't shown on any official map. The forest seemed unusually quiet, as if the normal sounds of wildlife had been suppressed by some presence that David couldn't identify but could definitely feel. We're close, Jim Hartwell said, consulting his GPS unit. Maybe 100 yards. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, drowning out the sound of his footsteps on the forest floor. Somewhere ahead, Through the trees and shadows, his daughter's Apple Watch was waiting. And if the watch was there, maybe Ava was too. They found the watch sitting on a carefully arranged bed of pine needles beside a small creek, positioned as if someone had placed it there deliberately for them to discover. The bright band was instantly recognizable, and David felt his knees nearly buckle with them, confirmation that they had finally found tangible evidence of his daughter's presence in these remote mountains. But Ava herself was nowhere to be seen. Sheriff Vasquez approached the watch carefully, photographing its position before picking it up with gloved hands. The device appeared undamaged, though the battery indicator showed less than 5% remaining power. When she activated the screen, David leaned in to see what information might be stored in the device's memory. What they found changed everything. The watch's activity log showed 21 days of continuous data: heart rate, GPS tracking, step counts, even ambient sound recordings triggered by the device's motion sensors. For 3 weeks, the watch had been monitoring and recording, creating a detailed record of wherever it had been. "Look at this," Sheriff Vasquez said, scrolling through the GPS data. "The watch has been moving almost continuously. Long-distance hiking patterns, multiple locations throughout the wilderness area." David stared at the tracking data, trying to process what it meant. The GPS trail showed systematic movement through the Sierra Pines, covering dozens of miles over the 3-week period. But most disturbing were the heart rate readings, steady and consistent throughout the entire period, indicating that whoever wore the watch had been alive and physically active. "She's been alive," David whispered. "For 3 weeks, Ava has been alive and moving through these mountains." But there was more. The watch had recorded audio snippets triggered by sudden movements or loud sounds, creating a fragmentary record of conversations and environmental noise. Sheriff Vasquez activated the first recording, and they listened to several seconds of static before Ava's voice came through clearly. "Are we going home soon? I miss my dad." David felt tears streaming down his face as he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in 21 days. She sounded scared but not panicked, lonely but not terrified. Most importantly, she sounded alive. The second audio recording was shorter but infinitely more disturbing. After a few seconds of rustling sounds, they heard Ava's voice again. "Who are you? Why can't I go home?" The response came from someone else, a voice that David didn't recognize, low, measured, deliberately calm. "She can stay, but you must forget her." Sheriff Vasquez replayed the recording several times, her expression growing grimmer with each repetition. "That's not a child's voice. We're definitely dealing with an adult, probably male, someone who has been holding Ava against her will." David studied the GPS trail on the watch's screen, tracing the path his daughter had walked over 21 days. The route was complex but purposeful, leading to areas of the wilderness that weren't accessible to casual hikers. Someone with extensive local knowledge had been guiding her through terrain that few people could navigate. "Where does the trail end?" David asked, pointing to the most recent GPS coordinates. Sheriff Vasquez consulted her topographical maps, comparing them to the watch's data. "About 3 miles northeast of here, there's an old mining area, some abandoned structures that date back to the 1800s. If someone wanted to hide a child, it would be a logical place." David was already moving toward the indicated direction, no longer willing to wait for tactical considerations or careful planning. His daughter was 3 miles away, alive, and had been calling for him. Nothing else mattered. "David, wait," Sheriff Vasquez called after him. "We need to approach this carefully. If they know we're coming, let them know," David replied without slowing down. "I've been looking for my daughter for 3 weeks. Now I know where she is, and I'm going to bring her home." The cabin emerged from the mountain face like something from a fairy tale, so perfectly integrated with the natural rock formation that David had to blink twice to convince himself it was real. Solar panels disguised as flat stones provided power, while a chimney built to look like a natural rock outcropping suggested heating and cooking facilities. Someone had spent years creating a dwelling that was completely invisible from above and nearly undetectable from ground level. David crouched behind a granite boulder with Sheriff Vasquez and Jim Hartwell, studying the structure through binoculars and trying to detect signs of current occupation. Thin smoke rose from the camouflage chimney, and solar batteries indicated active electrical systems. Most encouraging of all, children's clothes hung on a line that had been strung between two pine trees, including a turquoise shirt that made David's heart leap with recognition. "She's here," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's Ava's shirt. She's alive, and she's here." Sheriff Vasquez was speaking quietly into her radio, coordinating with the helicopter crew and ground teams that were moving into blocking positions around the hidden compound. The tactical situation was complex. They needed to rescue Ava without triggering a hostage situation or giving her captors an opportunity to escape with her into even more remote wilderness. "Movement," Jim Hartwell said quietly, pointing toward the cabin's entrance. A figure emerged from the structure, an elderly woman with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing clothing that looked handmade from natural fibers. She moved with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in wilderness surroundings, checking the solar panels and adjusting what appeared to be a water collection system. David felt a moment of cognitive dissonance. This wasn't the dangerous predator he'd been imagining for 3 weeks. The woman looked more like a grandmother than a kidnapper, someone who might bake cookies and tell bedtime stories, rather than abduct children from hiking trails, but appearances could be deceiving, and David forced himself to remember that whoever this woman was, she had taken his daughter and held her captive for 21 days. The gentle exterior might hide someone deeply disturbed. Someone who had created an elaborate fantasy where kidnapping children seemed reasonable and justified. "There," Sheriff Vasquez said. Pointing to another movement near the cabin, Ava stepped out of the structure, and David felt his world collapse and rebuild itself in the same instant. His daughter was alive, obviously healthy, and moving with the casual ease of someone who wasn't restrained or immediately threatened. She was wearing different clothes than when she'd disappeared, practical. Outdoor gear that looked like it had been made specifically for her size, but she appeared unharmed. David started to rise from his hiding place, every instinct demanding that he run to his daughter and sweep her into his arms. But Sheriff Vasquez grabbed his arm and held him back. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "We need to understand the situation before we act. If she's not in immediate danger, we can take time to plan the approach properly." David watched his daughter through the binoculars, studying her body language and behavior for signs of distress or coercion. Ava was talking animatedly with the older woman, gesturing toward the forest with the kind of enthusiasm he recognized from their hiking adventures. She didn't appear frightened or unhappy, which should have been reassuring, but somehow made the situation more confusing. "Why isn't she trying to escape?" David asked. "Ava knows these mountains. She could find her way back to the main trails if she wanted to." Jim Hartwell had been studying the compound's layout, identifying potential approach routes and escape paths. "Maybe she doesn't want to escape. Stockholm Syndrome can develop quickly in children, especially if their captors treat them kindly." The possibility that Ava might have bonded with her kidnapper added another layer of complexity to the rescue operation. If she resisted being taken from the only home she'd known for 3 weeks, the situation could quickly become traumatic for everyone involved. Sheriff Vasquez made a decision that balanced immediate action with tactical caution. "Jim, work your way around to the north side of the cabin. If they try to run, that's the most likely escape route. David, you're with me." We approach directly but slowly, giving them time to see us coming. "What if they have weapons?" David asked. "Then we handle it professionally. But so far, nothing we've seen suggests violent intentions. This feels more like misguided idealism than dangerous predation." David checked his equipment one final time. Water, emergency supplies, a small first aid kit, and most importantly, the satellite phone that would allow them to call for helicopter evacuation if Ava needed medical attention. After 21 days of uncertainty, he was minutes away from holding his daughter again. The approach to the cabin took nearly an hour as they moved carefully through terrain that offered minimal cover. Sheriff Vasquez insisted on maintaining stealth until they were close enough to control the situation, understanding that a panicked kidnapper might make decisions that endangered everyone. At 50 yards from the structure, they could hear voices clearly. Ava was asking questions about plant identification, her natural curiosity apparently unchanged by 3 weeks of captivity. The older woman was answering with the patience of an experienced teacher, providing information about wilderness survival and natural history that David recognized as both accurate and age-appropriate. "She's educating her," Sheriff Vasquez observed quietly, "teaching her wilderness skills, natural sciences, practical knowledge that most children never learn." The realization added another piece to the puzzle of Ava's disappearance. Perhaps her captor wasn't motivated by the usual pathologies associated with child abduction. Maybe this woman genuinely believed she was providing Ava with something valuable, something that justified taking her away from her father and the life she'd known. At 20 yards, Sheriff Vasquez made her presence known. "This is Sheriff Elena Vasquez," she called out clearly. "I need to speak with you about the child in your care." The reaction was immediate and telling. The older woman stepped protectively in front of Ava, but didn't appear panicked or threatening. Ava looked toward the sound of Sheriff Vasquez's voice with curiosity rather than fear. Her head tilted in the way David remembered from countless conversations where she was trying to understand something new. "Dad?" Ava's voice carried clearly across the clearing, filled with surprise but not distress. "Is that you, Dad?" David felt his carefully maintained composure shatter. His daughter was calling for him, alive and apparently unharmed, after 3 weeks that had aged him years. He stood up from behind his cover, no longer caring about tactical considerations or official procedures. "I'm here, sweetheart," David called back, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm here." Ava started toward him, but the older woman gently caught her arm, not roughly or threateningly, but with the kind of gentle restraint that suggested concern rather than control. She spoke quietly to Ava, words that David couldn't hear, but that made his daughter pause and look back at the cabin with obvious conflict. Sheriff Vasquez emerged from cover with her hands visible and empty, approaching the situation with professional calm, despite the emotional intensity radiating from everyone present. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to let the child come to us. Her father has been looking for her for 3 weeks. The older woman straightened to her full height, which was considerable, and David could see intelligence and determination in her weathered features. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen," she said clearly. "And before you make assumptions about this situation, I think you should know that Ava came to me willingly. She chose to stay here, and she's been free to leave whenever she wanted." David felt the world tilt sideways. Dr. Sarah Chen had been a respected child psychologist in Sacramento before disappearing 7 years ago, leaving behind a successful practice and a reputation for innovative work with troubled children. Her disappearance had been front-page news for weeks before the story faded into unsolved mystery. "You're supposed to be dead," Sheriff Vasquez said, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon before stopping as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. "I'm very much alive, as you can see, and I've been providing care for children who need something different than what conventional society offers them." Dr. Chen's voice was calm, but defiant. "Ava is not the first child who has found their way to me, and she won't be the last." David's relief at finding his daughter alive began mixing with anger as he understood what Dr. Chen was claiming. "You took her from a hiking trail. She didn't find her way to you. You kidnapped her. I offered her a choice," Dr. Chen replied firmly, "just as I offer every child who crosses my path. The choice to continue living in a world that damages them, or to learn a different way of being human." Ava was looking back and forth between her father and Dr. Chen with obvious confusion, caught between two worlds that suddenly seemed incompatible. When she spoke, her words carried a maturity that David didn't recognize. "Dad, she's been teaching me things. Important things about how to live without hurting the earth, how to be self-sufficient, how to think for myself instead of just accepting what other people tell me is true." David felt his heart breaking as he listened to his daughter unconsciously echoing the philosophy of her captor. In 3 weeks, Dr. Chen had begun reshaping Ava's worldview, introducing ideas and perspectives that challenged everything David had taught her about family, society, and the life they had built together. Dr. Chen reached into her jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with Ava's careful handwriting and detailed drawings. She held it out toward David with the solemnity of someone presenting crucial evidence in her own defense. "Perhaps you should read what your daughter has written about her time here," Dr. Chen said quietly, "before you make assumptions about what has happened to her." David took the journal with trembling hands, immediately recognizing Ava's distinctive writing style and the elaborate doodles that had decorated her school assignments for years. But as he read the first few entries, dated from the days immediately following her disappearance, he found himself confronting a version of events that challenged everything he thought he understood. Day 1. "I followed the trail markers that the nice lady left. She said I could come back anytime I wanted, but I wanted to see where they led. The cabin is amazing. It's like living inside a tree, but with solar power and running water. She says her name is Dr. Sarah, and she used to help kids like me who felt different." Day 3. "I keep thinking about going home, but Dr. Sarah says I don't have to decide right away. She's teaching me how to identify edible plants and how to read animal tracks. Today we saw a family of deer, and they weren't afraid of us because Dr. Sarah moved so quietly through the forest." Day 7. "Dr. Sarah asked me why I was sad sometimes even when Dad and I were hiking. I told her about Mom dying and how Dad tries so hard to make everything normal, but nothing feels normal anymore. She said grief changes people, and sometimes adults forget that kids grieve differently than they do." David felt tears blurring his vision as he read his daughter's words, recognizing truths about their relationship that he'd tried to ignore. Since Elena's death, he had focused so completely on maintaining stability and routine that he'd perhaps missed signs that Ava was struggling with her own emotional needs. Sheriff Vasquez moved closer, reading over David's shoulder, while keeping one eye on Dr. Chen and the surrounding forest. The entries continued for weeks, documenting a gradual transformation in Ava's perspective as she learned wilderness skills and engaged in conversations about life, death, nature, and the choices people make about how to live. Day 15. "Dr. Sarah showed me pictures of other kids who have lived here. She says some stay for a while and then go back to their families when they're ready. Others decide they want to learn a completely different way of living. She says the choice is always mine, but I have to understand what I'm choosing between." Day 18. "I dream about Dad every night. I know he's looking for me, and I know he's scared. Part of me wants to run back to him right now, but another part of me feels like I'm learning things here that I need to know, things that will make me stronger and smarter when I do go home." Day 21. "This morning I decided I want to see Dad again. I miss him too much to stay away any longer. Dr. Sarah says she understands and that she'll help me figure out how to return my Apple Watch so he can find me. She says the most important thing I've learned is that I always have choices, even when adults tell me I don't." David looked up from the journal to find Ava watching him with eyes that seemed older than her 9 years. The 3 weeks in the wilderness had changed her in subtle ways that he was only beginning to recognize. She stood straighter, moved with more confidence, and spoke with a thoughtfulness that suggested she'd been having conversations beyond her previous maturity level. "Sweetheart," David said carefully, "I need you to understand something very important. Dr. Sarah took you away from me without permission. That's called kidnapping, and it's illegal no matter what reason she had. Ava looked between her father and Dr. Chen, clearly struggling to reconcile different versions of morality and legal behavior. But she didn't force me, Dad. She asked if I wanted to learn about living differently, and I said yes. Doesn't that make it my choice? Dr. Chen stepped forward, her expression showing both defiance and resignation. Sheriff, I understand that you have to arrest me. I've violated numerous laws, and I accept the consequences of my actions. But I want you to consider the possibility that some children need experiences that conventional society cannot provide. What you're describing is a form of cult recruitment, Sheriff Vasquez replied firmly. Taking vulnerable children from their families and convincing them that isolation is better than the support systems they already have. Is it? Dr. Chen challenged. Look at her, Sheriff. Does Ava appear damaged or traumatized? Or does she appear more confident, more capable, more connected to the natural world than when I found her crying on that hiking trail? David felt his anger flaring as he remembered the 3 weeks of desperate searching, sleepless nights, and growing despair that Dr. Chen's educational experiment had cost him. She wasn't crying when you took her. She was excited about showing me something she'd discovered. You manipulated a child's natural curiosity to separate her from her family. Your daughter was crying, Mr. Martinez, Dr. Chen said gently, not visibly perhaps, but emotionally. She was carrying grief and confusion that she couldn't share with you because she was trying to protect your feelings. Children often sacrifice their own emotional needs to take care of the adults they love. The words hit David like physical blows because he recognized their truth. Since Elena's death, he had been so focused on being strong for Ava that he might have inadvertently discouraged her from expressing her own grief and confusion. In trying to protect her from additional pain, he might have isolated her from the emotional support she needed. Ava moved closer to her father, but stopped just out of reach, as if she was uncertain about how to bridge the gap between the person she had been 3 weeks ago and the person she had become. When she spoke, her voice carried a wisdom that broke David's heart. Dad, I love you and I want to come home, but I also want you to understand that I learned important things here. Dr. Sarah taught me that kids can be stronger and smarter than adults usually think we are. She taught me that grief isn't something you get over. It's something you learn to carry differently. David knelt down to Ava's eye level, struggling to find words that would acknowledge her growth, while still establishing the boundaries that their relationship required. Sweetheart, I'm proud that you learned new things and became stronger. But Dr. Sarah should have talked to me before taking you away. Families are supposed to make important decisions together. What if you had said no? Ava asked with devastating directness. What if you thought it was too dangerous or too different? Would you have let me choose for myself? David realized he was facing the most important conversation of his life as a father. His daughter was asking him to respect her autonomy while still accepting his responsibility to protect and guide her. The balance between those two needs would define their relationship for years to come. I don't know, David answered honestly, but I think we should have had the chance to discuss it together, to figure out what you needed and how to provide it safely. Dr. Chen had been listening to their conversation with the attention of someone who understood that her fate was being decided in real time. When she spoke, her voice carried both sadness and acceptance. Ava, your father loves you more than anything in the world. That was obvious from the moment he started looking for you. But love sometimes means letting people make their own choices, even when those choices are different than what we would choose for them. Sheriff Vasquez stepped forward with the practical authority of someone who needed to resolve a complex situation according to legal requirements and human compassion. Dr. Chen, I'm placing you under arrest for kidnapping and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right until you can speak with an attorney. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Dr. Chen looked directly at Ava with eyes that held both regret and hope. Remember what you learned here, child. Remember that you always have choices, and that the most important choice is deciding what kind of person you want to become. David watched his daughter absorb these final words from her captor-turned-teacher, understanding that the complexity of their situation would take years to fully unpack. Ava had been both victim and willing participant, both kidnapped and educated, both harmed and helped by her experience in the wilderness. The sound of helicopter rotors approaching reminded everyone that the outside world was waiting to reclaim them. With its legal proceedings, media attention, and social judgments about what had happened in the hidden cabin. But for this moment, father and daughter stood facing each other in a forest clearing, both changed by 3 weeks that had challenged everything they thought they knew about family, freedom, and the choices that shape our lives. 6 months later, David stood in the morning light streaming through the windows of their new home. A modest cabin situated on 20 acres of Sierra Pines foothills, where Ava could explore nature while remaining within sight of safety. The photograph on the mantelpiece showed father and daughter together, but both had been changed by their experience in ways that were still revealing themselves daily. Ava was taller, more confident, and moved through their rural property with the woodcraft skills that Dr. Chen had taught her during those controversial 3 weeks. She identified bird calls automatically, tracked the movements of local wildlife, and had established a vegetable garden using permaculture techniques that produced more food than their small family could consume. But most importantly, she talked openly about her emotions in ways that she never had before her disappearance. "I dreamed about Mom again last night," Ava said over breakfast, spreading honey from their own beehives on homemade bread. "But it was a good dream this time." "She was proud of how we learned to take care of ourselves," David nodded, no longer flinching when his daughter mentioned Elena or the grief that they had learned to carry together rather than separately. Dr. Chen's trial had been a media sensation, with child psychologists, legal experts, and education advocates debating the ethics of her methods and the validity of her results. But for David and Ava, the legal proceedings had been less important than the ongoing process of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honest communication and mutual respect. The court had ultimately sentenced Dr. Chen to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months based on psychological evaluation and community service. During her testimony, she had expressed genuine remorse for the pain her actions had caused David, while maintaining that Ava had needed the experience to develop emotional resilience and self-reliance. She was right about some things. Ava had told David during one of their long conversations about forgiveness and understanding. "I did need to learn that I was stronger than I thought. But she was wrong to take me away from you without talking to both of us first." David had struggled with his own feelings about Dr. Chen, alternating between gratitude for the positive changes in his daughter and anger about the 3 weeks of terror and uncertainty she had put him through. Eventually, he had reached a complex peace that acknowledged both the harm and the help that had resulted from Ava's time in the wilderness. The media attention had been intense but brief, focusing on the sensational aspects of the case rather than the deeper questions it raised about child autonomy, alternative education, and the ways that grief affects family relationships. David had given exactly 3 interviews, each time emphasizing that every family situation was unique and that no one should attempt to replicate Dr. Chen's methods. Sheriff Vasquez visited regularly, both in her official capacity and as someone who had become genuinely invested in their family's recovery. She had helped David navigate the legal complexities of establishing their new homestead, ensuring that all permits and safety requirements were properly documented. "Any word from the appeals court?" she asked during her monthly check-in, accepting a cup of coffee. From Ava, who had appointed herself the official hostess for all visitors. "Dr. Chen's lawyers are still pushing for a reduced sentence based on the psychological evaluations of her former students," David replied. "Apparently, several other children have come forward to describe positive experiences with her wilderness programs over the years." Sheriff Vasquez frowned. "That doesn't excuse kidnapping, no matter how well-intentioned her motives might have been." "No, it doesn't," David agreed. But it does complicate the story. Ava wasn't her first or only student, and from what I understand, most of the other children eventually returned to their families with improved emotional resilience and wilderness skills. The complexity of the situation had forced David to confront uncomfortable questions about conventional approaches to child-rearing, education, and the treatment of grief. Dr. Chen's methods were clearly illegal and ethically problematic, but they had also produced results that traditional therapy and counseling had failed to achieve. Ava's school had accommodated her new learning style by allowing her to design independent study projects that incorporated her wilderness skills with traditional academic subjects. She was currently working on a comprehensive report about sustainable agriculture that would satisfy requirements for both science and social studies while allowing her to apply knowledge gained during her time with Dr. Chen. "I want to visit her," Ava announced one evening as they sat by their fireplace, reading together in the comfortable silence that had become their new evening routine. David looked up from his book, not entirely surprised by the request, but still uncertain about how to respond. "Visit Dr. Chen in prison? She taught me important things, Dad. I know what she did was wrong, but I also know that she cared about me and wanted to help me become stronger. I think she deserves to know that I'm okay, that I'm using what she taught me in good ways." David considered his daughter's request, weighing his own complicated feelings against Ava's need for closure and expression of gratitude. Dr. Chen had irrevocably changed their lives, and not all of those changes had been negative. "If you want to visit her, we can arrange that," David said finally. "But I want you to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what someone did wrong. You can be grateful for what you learned while still recognizing that her methods caused real harm." "I understand," Ava replied with the thoughtful seriousness that had become characteristic of her since returning from the wilderness. "But I also think that people can do wrong things for right reasons, and that doesn't make them completely bad people." 3 weeks later, they sat across from Dr. Chen in the visiting room of the minimum security facility where she was serving her sentence. The woman who had taken Ava from the hiking trail looked older and frailer, but her eyes still held the intelligence and determination that David remembered from their confrontation in the forest. "You look well, child," Dr. Chen said to Ava, her voice warm with genuine affection. "Are you still practicing the skills we worked on together?" "Every day," Ava replied. "Dad bought property where I can garden and explore, and he's learning some of the techniques too. We're partners now in taking care of ourselves." Dr. Chen looked at David with an expression that combined apology with defiance. "I know you can never forgive me for the fear I caused you, but I hope you can see that your daughter is stronger now, more capable of handling life's challenges." "She is," David acknowledged. "But that doesn't justify what you did. There had to be legal ways to provide children with wilderness education and emotional support." "Perhaps," Dr. Chen replied. "But the legal ways often fail children who need something different, something more immediate and transformative than what conventional systems provide." The conversation continued for an hour, touching on responsibility, healing, and the complex ways that traumatic experiences could sometimes lead to positive growth. When they finally left, David felt a sense of closure that he hadn't expected, a recognition that their ordeal had ended not with simple justice or clear-cut resolution, but with a deeper understanding of the complicated relationship between love, protection, and freedom. As they drove home through the Sierra Pines foothills, Ava reached over and took her father's hand. "Dad, do you think we would have figured out how to talk about Mom and grief if Dr. Chen hadn't taken me away?" David considered the question honestly, recognizing that their current closeness and communication had been built partly on the foundation of nearly losing each other. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe we would have eventually, but I'm grateful that we did figure it out. Whatever it took to get us here." The photograph on their mantelpiece captured them at sunset on their property. Father and daughter standing together, but each maintaining their own space, connected but not clinging. It was a picture of a family that had been broken and rebuilt, stronger in some ways because they had learned to respect each other's individual strength while maintaining their essential bond. In the months that followed, their story would continue to evolve. Ava would grow into a teenager who balanced wilderness skills with social connections, someone equally comfortable tracking deer through forest paths and navigating the social complexities of high school. David would eventually remarry, finding love again with a woman who appreciated both his devotion to his daughter and his understanding. That love sometimes meant allowing people the freedom to make their own choices, but the lessons learned during those 3 weeks in the Sierra Pines would remain with them always. The knowledge that families could survive almost anything if they learned to communicate honestly, that strength could come from unexpected sources, and that the most important choice in any relationship was the daily decision to keep choosing each other again and again, even when the world offered other possibilities. The mountain, where Ava had disappeared, still drew hikers and adventurers. But David and Ava no longer needed to search its hidden trails for answers. They had found what they were looking for not in the wilderness, but in the courage to build a new life together, one that honored both their shared history and their individual growth. Every morning, David still woke up grateful that his daughter was safe in her bed down the hall. And every morning, Ava still woke up grateful that she had learned she was strong enough to survive anything, but lucky enough to have a father who would never stop searching for her, no matter how far she might wander.